when professional skeptics resort to trickster science to debunk astrology, truth, science, and astrology are all compromised. In this video, I talked to Robert Currey about how critics and skeptics mismanage the truth about astrology. If you're interested in the backstory of the origins of modern astrology skepticism, the inside story about the famous Carlson study, real examples of how critics bend the rules and science tilts the playing field, or if you're an astrology researcher looking to get your papers published, then keep watching. Our guest, Robert Currey, is the editor of the Correlation Journal, founder of the software company Equinox, the science editor for Astrology News Service, and a professional astrologer specializing in astrocartography. Is there evidence-based research to back up astrology's claims about the impact on our lives?
There is, but our claims are greater than the evidence at this point. You know, we make a lot of claims as astrologers, and research is just a small part of it, but it is an area that has started to grow in the last 20 years. And in Correlation, I published 66 papers, evidence-based papers, that were looking at the correlation between the movement of the heavens and life on Earth. And any paper that was supporting that, we published. Now, most of those papers were published in the last 20 years. So the evidence is increasing. We're never going to prove astrology, but we are increasing the evidence. And it's the same as any other area of science. You just can't prove any theory, like Darwin's theory is a theory, but the evidence grows, and the same applies to astrology.
Being a skeptic is healthy, and every field has its critics, astrology probably more than most. Astrology's arch critic is undoubtedly CSI, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, formerly known as SCICOP, Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. Paul Kurtz started SCICOP in the spring of 1976. What motivated him to start, and how's the organization evolved since then?
Yeah, it's fascinating, really, or to me anyway. At the time he started, astrology was flourishing, almost mushrooming in his eyes, with magazines and newspapers all over the world producing astrology columns. And he felt that these were accepted uncritically, and he felt quite offended. He was actually a professor of philosophy, not a scientist, like a lot of psychops are not scientists. But he started this group, and he started Prometheus Publishing and the Skeptical Inquirer. And his problem I kind of understood where he was coming from. It made sense, but then he had a problem because this chap in France, Michel Gauquelin, started producing evidence. I mean, really solid papers with, he was a scientist, and he did very large studies of sports people and politicians, and was producing results that seemed to be more or less in line with traditional astrology. And Kurtz had a big problem. So he took it upon himself to go into battle with Michel Gauquelin and his results. And when he tested them, he actually verified the results. And he tried very hard not to.
The rise of astrology during that time basically provoked him into wanting to debunk the claims, basically, of astrology.
Kurt started with the sun sign columns. And then while he was in this program, and he actually got 192 scientists, Nobel Prize top scientists, to write a letter. It was published in The Humanist, which was their objections to astrology. And the interesting thing on that is that Carl Sagan, who was very well known as an astronomer and a television personality, refused to do this because he said, he looked at that argument, he said, just because you don't know the mechanism for astrology does not mean it's not valid. And he cited the case of continental drift, which was initially found by Wegener, and then it turned out that, and people poo-pooed it. You look at a map of Africa and South America, and when I was at school, I said they must have joined, and they said nonsense. Anyway, then they discovered plate tectonics, so they verified him. And there's Carl Semmelweis, there are many cases where mechanism is not the determinism of the validity of something, and that was what the problem. So anyway, they carried on. They published the paper. 192 scientists, not one would be interviewed on the topic. Anyway, that was an interesting juncture for astrology, and that was really the start of modern skepticism.
The Shawn Carlson experiment is known as the most famous test that falsifies astrology. Why is this CSI-funded study, published in 1985, still the go-to research for critics today?
The main answer is that it was published in Nature, which was one of the top scientific journals. And how it was published is a more interesting story. Well, the editor of Nature at that time was a skeptic called John Maddox, and he was a fellow of SciCoP. Now, it's SciCoP who sponsored the Carlson test. Maddox managed to get it in. I don't believe it was published in the main body of the magazine. It was published in a section that is not normally peer-reviewed. It's like a review or letter section within the journal. But the fact that it went into Nature makes it almost unassailable in terms of being considered the top study. But no less than three professors have said that it's a flawed study, and including the most famous psychology professor at the time, and one of the most published was Hans Eysenck. That led on to me doing a study, reviewing why they came up to those conclusions.
So SciCoP funded the study after the Gokulin controversy to try and improve their standing, basically, with their skeptical inquiry mission.
Yes, they did. The Gokula experience was a very bad one for SciCoP and for Paul Kurtz personally, because a lot of people resigned because they realized the skeptics were not being objective. They were debunking. And they didn't want to be part of that. That isn't science, And so this was a kind of rescue attempt. But of course, the way it was billed was not as a SciCoP presentation. It was actually Shawn Carlson was an undergraduate physics undergraduate. Why he was doing a sociological study, which it was, for a physics paper is hard to know. And his guiding professor, mentor, was also a fellow of SciCoP. And it was only much later that Paul Kurtz said, yeah, we did that. It was ours, chalk it up, and it was their, it was their victory. And that's fine. It wasn't a victory for science. It wasn't a victory for truth. And it was not a good thing for astrology and the process of astrology, because I think that result put the kibosh on a lot of research. I think there were papers before, and there are really good astrologers around who just think that the moment you look under the bonnet in astrology, you're going to find that it's just nothing, it doesn't stand up to science, and that's wrong.
So you reviewed the Carlson tests and found research design flaws and evidence of p-hacking. Can you just briefly take us through the highlights of that?
Yeah. Well, with the Carlson test, it was, he gathered together about 100 students, and they did a self-fulfilling report called the California Personality Inventory. It's a very old-fashioned type of report. And they were first asked, could they identify their own chart, their own psychological profile, based on their own reporting from 3 others, and they couldn't, not to a significant level. And then they were asked to identify their birth chart out of 3, and they could, but only to marginal significance. And then they were asked to rate each match, and then they could to a significant level. And I suppose but the only way we know this is when it was published, you would not see this because it was separated. The studies were separated out, and you couldn't. In fact, 2 studies were actually with different sample sizes were merged in order to create 3 histograms. And you look at them and you think, well, that looks random to me. And but when you put the numbers together from 3 different categories, then you start to see a pattern.
I have a 50% chance of calling a single toss of a coin correctly. If I tossed this coin 10 times and made 7 correct calls, I may think I have some super guessing ability. But statistically, the probability is 1 in 6 that the 7 correct calls were made purely by chance. The odds of chance are very high. Therefore, the outcome is not significant. But if I tossed the coin 100 times and made 70 correct calls, still 70% correct, there is a 1 in 25,000 probability that these 70 correct results were made purely by chance. Statistically, the odds of chance are very low, and therefore the outcome significant. We can use this very simple example to understand key hacking and data butchery. Now, if we were to take this bigger sample and break it down into groups, remove some of the tosses and remove some of the group, and then measure the smaller group for probability, we would lose the statistical significance of the bigger sample size. A member of CSI, Jeffrey Dean, has written 4 books detailing his finding against astrology. He's an incredibly convincing critic. One of the myths he's created is that hundreds of tests have solved the puzzle about the truth of astrology. You wrote a truth bomb of a review in the Correlation Journal in 2014 about his book, Astrology Under Scrutiny. What did you find in general about his claims and about this myth?
Yeah, well, it is an interesting thing, and that really is the theme of his book. It's been modified. The claim has sort of been adapted a little bit, but essentially, yeah, there's no, we keep testing astrology and there's nothing to it. Now, the first thing is, we haven't really tested astrology. We think we tested astrology. We think, oh, the thousands of papers, but you look at a subject, not just physics, but string theory, or you look at any field of science, and we are talking of thousands of studies, thousands. Astrology, if he says there's hundreds, there might be, but are they proper studies? Now, the studies he's published fall into, I think it's 5 categories. I kind of made a list. And the first one is sun sign tests. And there are problems with that, because if a sun sign test is successful, they say, oh, it's self-attribution, because we found that Leos were proud and Virgos had attention to detail because they know it because of their sign. And so that's a factor. Then there's another factor is they say, well, if people can guess sun signs, then they must be psychic, and it's not astrology. And the problem with sun sign tests is they are single factor tests, and you need very, very large samples with times of birth, and they're just not available to get, to do sun sign. So that's one part. And then the other problem is they're often small samples, like, a paper like one of which is James Randi, a magician testing an astrologer. This isn't a scientific paper. This isn't a proper test. Being tested by a magician, like go and make a prediction, whatever. It's not fair. And James Randi is not a statistician. He's not very good at mathematics, so he said. And that isn't right. So the small samples are a big problem, and there are very few big samples. I mean, we think in astrology that 100 people is a big sample, but in vaccines, we're looking at millions to be able to establish things. So we're not doing that in astrology. We're not using the big data, because you don't get times of birth. You can get sun signs, and that's pretty useful. And then the other thing was that quite often there's straw man tests, which is claims that astrologers don't make. For example, something like cerebral palsy. There was a test, and we don't know what incidence in the birth chart would cause that. So you can't really say, because they didn't find evidence in cerebral palsy, and this was a skeptic doing the study anyway, therefore, astrology can't be valid. That's just a straw man argument. A lot of the tests are flawed, and in fairly obvious ways. One did a test where you had to choose between 23 different charts to do a match. Now, when you work out the odds of matching 23 different birth charts, and they were all born within 2 years, 2 people, you have a huge number of possibilities. The factorial of 23, I don't know what it is, but it was huge. And they couldn't do it. You were asking an impossible task. So that was a flawed study. And there are many others that are flawed in paper. And then the last are the ones that support astrology. And the ones that do inevitably are debunked. I use that word because debunk is not to actually invalidate, it is to attempt to invalidate to all appearances.
There's an important story about the astrologer Paul Westrand's experience in his collaboration with Dean around Westrand's Sun-Venus couples research that I think is on point for this interview. Can you share the story?
Paul has taken over 20 years and he's done 1,300 celebrity couples. Now, Dean on the first study he's not seen the validation study, but the first study, Dean then divided it up and he took, I think he said, oh, well, I'm going to take couples that were born after 1900. But he actually used another group. He used another factor to divide it. So there was a mistake there, but that didn't really matter. But what he did was he chopped the samples into smaller and smaller groups. And some groups have like 1 or 2 people in. And then he says, wow, the significance has gone. Well, I could have told you that, without even looking at the paper. If you divide up a sample, the significance goes. And I don't know why it is that I think a lot of people reading these studies are quite uncritical. They don't really understand astrology. And if you read it and you don't think about it, you might well believe it. But if you know what p-hacking is, and now hopefully more people do, they will watch out for it from debunking, because it's just not acceptable. And if he's going to do another p-hacking book, we're going to call it out.
You've basically been contributing to the Correlation Journal for decades, and now you are the editor. Congratulations. Well, what is your vision at this amazing time as well? Well, what is your vision for the Scientific Astrology Journal Correlation for 2021 and beyond?
Well, I want to get more quantitative studies. They're not easy to find, but I want quantitative studies. I do understand about the theory is important, the mechanism is important, and qualitative studies are of value. But I'm trying to get the quantitative. I want statistics, and I want good graphs that explain it to everyone. I want people to write in a way that everyone can understand. There is no in-house code. Skepticism is really important, but I do believe that this needs to come from us, from astrologers. We need to be our own skeptics. We can't be having people who are just aiming to debunk astrology as a kind of break. If we had our own breaks inside and we said, It's not that I don't personally want to debunk other astrology theories, but I want to make sure that if we publish something in correlation, it's got to be solid.
If you appreciate this video, like, subscribe, and most importantly, share it with your friends, colleagues, and family. Comment below if this video has motivated you to take a more serious look at astrology, and let us know in the comment section who you'd like to see interviewed on the research series.